Namaste, good afternoon everyone. I'm Ruchira and I am a journalist and activist who works against sex trafficking. And I have edited two anthologies, one on the writings of Gloria Steinem and the other on prostitution stories in Indian short fiction in 14 different languages and translated into English. And I'm really proud. I live in Calcutta and in a small village in Bihar and in the city of New York, all three of which I call home. And I'm really proud to be a part of the third Jaipur Literature Festival today with such a wonderful panel who have all made different cities their home and yet understand the sense of exile that our generation currently feels very strongly, and the idea of the shrinking cosmopolitanism in our world where nationalist fervor, nativist fervor is growing, and people are inhabiting many cities, traveling a lot, and yet there are people who are dislocated, displaced, either by man-made disasters or natural disasters, and don't have a place to call home at all. Sometimes they are uncitizened, as we've seen in the northeastern states of India. Sometimes they are literally arrested and put into jails in mainland from their own homes, as we've seen in Kashmir with 3,000 children. And also, as we see in United States, people who are migrating just because they need jobs or food and stopped at the borders, separated from their families, held hostage in private detention camps. So we can see that the world is becoming a more cruel place for people who are migrating and who have very little, while it becomes a more hospitable place for people who have some kind of capital, of knowledge, of money and skills. And how do we navigate this in our times? So I have a wonderful panel who have already dealt with this, and I would like to begin by introducing Zarrar Said, who has written a book called Pure Land. And Pure Land is about the sense of exile, about migration, sense of loss, and literally he had to fight to make sure the book was available because it was being drowned out by the hatred of people who wanted to suppress it. I have with me Prajwal, who is from Nepal and Sikkim, lives in Calcutta, also has a home in New York and London, again in many places. And while he has places to call home, he also deals with populations in his country of origin who are being displaced from other places and being locked up in refugee camps and with nowhere to go. I also have Alia Malek, and many of you may have read her column today in New York Times about the idea of being a refugee and what happens. She's writing a diary of like dispatches on what happens to one particular refugee family from Syria. And Neeraj Kaushal, who teaches in this city and also has dealt with the idea of home, seeking a home, and the idea of exile. So I have people who can comment much more than I can. And so I would like to start by asking Zarrar, what does home mean to you?
That's a very complicated question, and I think one of the quintessential things about home and exile and everything is we are a migrating, animal, a migrating creature. Ever since we left the African savannah, thousands of years ago, we haven't stopped moving. And the one thing that it boils down to is the element of nostalgia. And like you said, a lot of the time, it's about sorrow of leaving and estrangement, what Edward Said calls the sorrow of estrangement. But for the most part, nostalgia is the expression of love. And I think for people, for me especially, that makes for wonderful storytelling. And I think when we talk about these stories, and if love is this central theme, it makes for great characters, and makes for wonderful landscape where you can build things and tell stories to people of where they're from or where you're from. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
So is that the storytelling makes you feel that you're at home?
Yeah, and also it also brings you bring with yourself the luggage of your past, and this is one way of unfolding that. So.
What about you, Neeraj? What does home mean to you?
Home. Well, home has always been the place where I live. But when you started talking about home, I came to the United States 21 years ago on my own choice. I was not forced to leave. But for a very long time, not the home of my dream, but home in my dream was always this dilapidated place, which in my dream I associated that with the place where I grew up and lived for many, many years in Delhi. Those of you who are from Delhi who would probably know Ranjit Nagar, which is close to Patel Nagar, Karol Bagh area. So that was the home in my dream, and I was constantly in the dream looking after or cleaning this some old furniture of when I was growing up, a bookshelf, which later in my own house, in my real house, it became a shelf where we started putting our shoes. And it was when I talk about it, it becomes a very boring thing because it was visiting me all the time. It was every night for many years. And as I became more comfortable with New York, and I now call New York my home, I've been here for 21 years. I go back to India. The city of Delhi is also home in some ways, but it's I don't have a home there. I go there, I feel I belong, I get very excited about Indian issues. I love Indian cuisine, Indian culture. I am Indian, settled in New York for now. So Delhi is home, New York is home, but there was a time when I moved to the US, there was another home in my dream. And I have, as a researcher, spoken with other people about this, and I find that I'm not unique in my dream. A lot of people have that kind of a dream.
Right. Alia, for you, what Neeraj said was home was a memory in a way, almost like, when she went to Delhi, though she doesn't have a physical space, there are things from memory which exist, the bookshelf, the streets, the food. What is home for you?
Thank you to the Jaipur Literary Festival for having me back again. It's such a pleasure. Can you hear me? Hello?
Oh.
Can you hear me now?
That's nice.
We're about to get really close here. Home is the person that you can just meet and start speaking to their microphone, I guess. You brought up the second dispatch that ran today in the New York Times Magazine, and as a Syrian and as a journalist, so somebody who doesn't have to spend as much time really having to be in touch with my emotions as a novelist, which is probably says something about my psychology. I've been asking this question of a lot of people in the last 7 years because of the massive displacement that we've seen of Syrians. And in today's dispatch, the woman who I profile, what I came to understand was that for her, home over the last 7 years of displacement had become such an unattainable concept that she's not even looking for it anymore. And for me to answer for you what home is for me is also sort of a function of privilege and luxury that, I'm less interested in that question now. And I'm much more interested in the question of when the concept becomes unattainable, when it's something that is out of reach for so many people, and many more people are in the midst of migrations now than not than ever before, but then since the post-World War II period. What does home then, when that concept is unattainable, when it almost becomes irrelevant, then what replaces it? And what does that mean for those of us who are in the communities that are taking people in or not taking people in? And on the point of nostalgia, it was Mahmoud Darwish, another Palestinian, a poet, who sort of problematized the concept of nostalgia. And we've seen this a lot in the last 8 years since what happened to Syria, the nostalgia for the jasmine, the nostalgia for the orange blossoms, the nostalgia for the small winding streets. And that does make for great narrative fodder, but it also can be very crippling. And that's also something I think that as writers, I kind of like this though, that we have a responsibility to not overplay or over sort of emphasize. And yes, and for those of us who can think about home in terms of a geographic space, well, we are quite lucky. And the other thing I would say about that, and this is something we were talking about before, is the idea that home is permanent. I think for all those people who are on the move, and obviously for Syrians, that's an illusory kind of permanence. And I have found that Syria if there was one thing that seemed certain about Syria, was that it was unchangeable, and you took for granted the idea that whether it's this nostalgic mythological home, that it would always be there. And in a world where the concept is unattainable, where the concept is not permanent, then those are the questions I'm much more interested in interrogating as I continue my work reporting on Syrians in exile.
It's true, Alia, because I grew up with I used to hear this sentence all the time, that nothing is permanent except change.
Yeah.
And it was fine till things began to change. And just today I read, for example, that Lutyens' Delhi is going to change, and the buildings are going to be destroyed, like Parliament or North Block, South Block, and some other things. And I thought, how will I feel when I go back to Delhi when that doesn't exist? Yes, it's a center of privilege, but it was my permanent privilege, right? And so I felt a sense of loss just reading the article. And when you mentioned that you thought Syria was permanent, that's exactly what I felt about India, that I could come and have an adventure in different parts of the world, come to New York, go to live in Tehran as I did for UNICEF, or Nepal or Bangkok or whichever, Kosovo even. But I always had India to go back to. And so it's a strange feeling to know that nothing is permanent, really. It's true. So Prajwal, you are literally from Nepal and Sikkim and Calcutta and New York, and have written a book which talks about land that I must flee, and are now working on a very interesting book on Sikkim again. And what is home to you? Because do you feel a sense of shrinking space or expanding space? What is home?
Excuse me, can you hear me? Yes. That's good. I am the son of a Nepali mother and a Nepali-speaking Indian father. So when I was growing up, there was this constant oscillation between Nepal and India. What was interesting was this was in the early 90s, and there was a lot of hatred in Nepal for India. Rajiv Gandhi had done some crazy stuff. I think there were blockades that had been issued, and so there was a lot of hatred, whereas people in the Nepali-speaking belts of India were trying to distance themselves from Nepal as much as they could in order to ascertain their Indian identity. So I grew up thinking that my mom's family and my dad's family hated each other. They didn't, though. I mean, they were at loggerheads with each other. And I now live between London, New York, and India, which I realize is the kind of thing that makes people want to punch you in the face. Because, the notion of privilege associated with it is so ridiculous, especially when we talk about it on a panel like this, where, there are people who, referring back to your column, there are people who don't have a home to go back to. I may call myself a citizen of the world and a few other cliched things, but home to me is the mountains of India, is Darjeeling, is the former Himalayan kingdom of Sikkim. My state in India was a kingdom until 1975, and we were annexed by India then. And now we've become a very, very pampered part of the country. The Indian government has flushed so much money into the state that everyone is happy. Our last queen was an American. How is that for a different kind of migration? Fifth Avenue debutante goes to Darjeeling on vacation and falls in love with the king and suddenly becomes the second Grace of Monaco. That is still home to me. I may say things like, I live between a few places, and, the mountains are home, and that's what I write about. I realized what was home to me when I found out that I could not write about anything other than that Nepali-speaking belts of India and Nepal. So it's sometimes writing gives you these wonderful realizations, and I'm now proud to say that my home is not any of the three places I live in. It's actually the Himalayas. Does that make sense?
Yes, I remember.
Sort of pretentious, I know.
I don't know. You were also talking about going and living in Mussoorie, so I guess you do love the Himalayas.
Another mountain place. God, this panel reeks of privilege. I mean, I hope you guys beat us up the minute we walk out of the stage or something.
No, I don't want to be beaten up, and I don't want to fight with anyone. But I do want to think about, the idea of privilege and exile and Zarrar. You have taken that on in your book in such a huge way, the notion of exile. And would you like to explain that while we have the sense of home in our writing, as Prajwal is talking about, and you said that in your earlier comments, where do you locate the sense of exile? Where is it coming from? Is it what's going on to others? Is it what's going on to you?
For me, I think I use the word exile very liberally. I think even it doesn't have to be escaping from horrible things. It cannot be something as simple as going to another country for a university or something like that. So I think for me that was, you still carry a lot of sorrow. I think the idea of exile in my book is important because it, by the way, the story is about a man who born in a village, goes on to win the Nobel Prize in physics, and then is banished from his country. It's a true story, which I turned into a fiction novel. And it became a love story of a love for a homeland that doesn't love him back. So for me, that exile worked perfectly as the story progressed, because it's a true tragedy. And in that case, the exile was started off as a self-exile, but then became a permanent thing. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, yeah, I don't think there are any answers to this, right? So
I think it's very important for us to understand that most of the migration happens by choice, and we still feel a lot of like he was saying, when he starts writing, he can only write about that place. I think that's true for most writers.
Yeah.
You can ask, even Salman Rushdie can write as many books as he wants about New York, but there'll always be a Bombay boy in there, Yeah. And that's true for all writers. And I think that sense of, for me, I'm very lucky because I grew up all over the world, and I kind of can relate to being in Dubai or being in Pakistan or even in Ohio. Like, I can understand those kind of stories. So for me, I'm lucky that I can close my eyes and go to those places and pick up the stories from there. So I think it is important that it's important for me, like as a writer, that we tell these stories, because we're a storytelling creature. So that's the only way we can talk about ourselves. It's kind of narcissistic, I think. Yeah.
Neeraj, what about you? Do you feel a sense of exile even with your bookcase here?
No, I don't have a sense of exile. I chose to, as you said, that most immigration is by choice, and I chose to come here. Home is a big thing for me, so I can see when I see people, when I hear their stories, there's this shrinking feeling in me, thinking about they don't have a home or they're searching for a home. So a few months ago, I was in San Diego, and I met with this girl who's currently doing her master's in social work, and she was born in Thailand in a refugee camp. For the first 15 years of her life, she lived in the camp. So did her siblings. And then when she was 15, they were able to get refugee status. It takes several years for you to get the refugee permission. And they came to San Diego. She has done very well. They came in 2007, and now she is actually doing MSW. Her brother, who's a few years older than her, was not able to even finish his high school. So when you're talking about exile, I think about these two siblings who were both born in a refugee camp. One of them, I haven't asked them this question, but I'm trying to think, how do they feel? You know, one of them, clearly it was clear when I met with them, with the girl, that she does belong, she can see her future contributing to the society, and the brother who has actually helped the family settle in the beginning doesn't have the same feeling. Similarly, when I was in Amman, Zatari refugee camp, and I met with some people who had moved from Syria, the same feeling about exile. I mean, that's where I could actually see that they might be feeling, they feel the exile. Many of them were saying they want to go back.
Yeah.
But I, personally, I don't have, I look at immigration, my work is more about, I'm a person of facts. My book is not about stories. I wish I could. I hope someday I'll write a story on migrants. But this is about, the book that I have is about growing discontent about immigration all over the world. It's not just in the United States, you see that in Europe, and not just in Europe, you see that in Asia, in India, in many African countries. And earlier in the day, I had a speaker in my class who works on Mexico. He's a community level worker here, and he was telling me that Mexicans are upset about Central Americans in Mexico. So my book was about trying to answer this question about why is there so much discontent towards immigrants. Is it because of immigration, or is it because of some other factors? And all over the world we are making immigrants and scapegoats. And I kind of reached the conclusion that it's more like immigration can solve many of the problems. And the problem is not immigration, but it's the problem of countries' inability to manage immigration, inability to manage, or political inability to actually accept immigration. And it's not, immigrants are not the culprit. So I look at immigration I teach the topic, and I try to look at the positive aspects of it. It is a choice for most people, and it helps the person who moves most. It also helps the sending country through remittances. It also helps a lot to the countries that are receiving them. That's my story on immigration.
Yes, and Einstein was an immigrant to this country, as many of you know. So immigrants bring value to countries, and yet we know what the saga is, which is unfolding right now on the borders of this country. Alia, you are Muslim, and you know about the growing Islamophobia in many countries across the world, including here. And how do you feel about making this country your home?
Well, I hate to disappoint you, I'm not Muslim. I have a sort of ambiguous name which works to my benefit, I guess.
I see.
If you're pro-Muslim, not if you're not pro-Muslim. But I come from a country that the culture is Muslim. Mm-hmm. The same way probably like Italy's culture is Catholic, even if not everybody is Catholic. Also, I don't really necessarily identify with religion in general, but how do I feel about, I grew up in the 70s and the 80s here in the United States and Arab in America, and that was really the more relevant category, more than Muslim. At the time, that was the other, the sort of imagined other from the Middle East, and it came with, we keep coming back to Palestine, which is interesting, but the othering of Arabs in the United States was around the question of Palestine. So Islamophobia is sort of a recent, I guess 9/11 is now 18 years ago, but a more sort of recent articulation of the othering of people from the Middle East. Again, I'm less interested. This is, I guess, maybe this is a function of being a journalist and a nonfiction writer. I'm much less interested in my own experience or my own feelings about a place. I would just say that it is dismaying, the sort of Islamophobia that we are seeing, and that it's coming from many quarters. It's in the United States, it's in India, regrettably, and it was interesting to be because Indians usually presume my name is Arabic. Also, my sister married in Indian, and their first concern, I think, was that we were Muslim, which was, anyway, it was interesting. But they're happily married now for several years, and they've got cute kids. It's all wonderful. But this is a current it's a specific articulation of a kind of human impulse that I think exists regardless. I mean, it's specifically against Muslims this time around, and many quarters of the world are sort of participating in whipping up fury around it. But the kind of othering that we see manifests in other ways in other contexts. Once it was about Jews in Europe. There are probably many. There are many contexts. I think again the question is, why we're home, which was just sort of more interesting for me to interrogate, and maybe we can talk about this together, is why are places that were so cosmopolitan and diverse and multi-sectarian and multi-religious and multi-ethnic once upon a time, whether it was India or the Ottoman Empire, why are these sort of the centers of that kind of a collapse? It's interesting to me, and whether or not there's a relationship between that. I feel like you should be able to drop the mic after the next one.
Prajwal, do you want to add to?
We were talking about Exile. Although I grew up in one of the most peaceful states in India, if not the most stable state in India, right next to me is a beautiful country called Bhutan that I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. When we think of Bhutan, we think gross national happiness, we think Buddhism, we think beautiful mountains, we think the loveliest people in the world. And Bhutan is all those things, which is wonderful. But Bhutan is also responsible for an extremely heinous ethnic cleansing experiment that not very many of us know about. Since the 80s, more than 110,000 Nepali-speaking Bhutanese refugees have been exiled from the borders of Bhutan. Why? Because Bhutan thought they were not Bhutanese enough to be Bhutanese. The jettisoning happened on account of language and religion. And so these people went back to Nepal, and Nepal said, well, your ancestors have been gone from Nepal for too long for you to be Nepalese. So they languished in a state of statelessness for 20 years on the Indo-Nepal border until the International Organization for Migration and the United Nations High Commission for Refugees decided to resettle them in a few countries, of which America is one. Now, I think America has resettled about 85,000 Bhutanese refugees, and they're often resettled in the whitest states in the country. So you go to Vermont, you may find your cluster of Bhutanese Nepali families. You go to Colorado, you go to Maine. Now, not all is well in the land of milk and honey, though. I read about a year and a half, 2 years ago in the Atlantic and the Washington Post that the suicide rate among the Bhutanese refugees in America is now the highest among any immigrant community in the country. Again, I mean, have the Nepalese Bhutanese gone through the same degree of torture and that a lot of the other refugees have? Perhaps not. I mean, there may have been murders and maiming and rape, but not to the extent that a lot of other refugee groups faced. Why should we as New Yorkers care about it? It's because a lot of these people who have been settled in, these middle of nowhere places are actually converging in Jackson Heights, Queens. Are actually in New York. So I think the Bhutanese Nepalis are now the highest growing ethnic group in New York.
Oh, really?
I could be wrong.
But you could be right.
Neeraj, I could be wrong. Don't hate me later.
I won't repeat that.
Okay. But I'm pretty sure it's up there somewhere. And I have written about this in my novel, and because I can't do the kind of stuff that Alia and Neeraj do, which is looking at facts and figures. What we lesser writers do is fictionalize things and hope as many people read them. Does that make sense?
Last question, and then we'll open it up, and anybody can take it first, whoever likes to. But really, all of you also have this cosmopolitan sensibility where there's sort of, bringing together world cultures, world religions. There's a fluidity and, basic human values that you're trying to bring forth in your writings. And when you look at the world now, what do you see? Like, what is the one thing that stands out to you most?
For me, especially for this novel to have it come about, was because I felt that something really bad was about to happen. I had that constant feeling of an empire is about to crumble, And this thing started. I have a friend who was kidnapped by the Taliban, and that's when it hit me that things can quickly shift from one side to another. And I think, like we talked about just now, these themes are reoccurring in history over and over again, right? So the Persian Empire wiped out overnight, never to come back again, right? Rome, and now the beautiful country of Syria, right? And these things start off by small sparks of hatred that go on into become waves and tsunamis that wipe out entire cultures. And we can see how that's happening here, right? So one of the things that I talk about in the book is Pure Land can be anywhere, right? It can be any sort of environment, any even your neighborhood can have that, or your school, or wherever where you work. So it's important that we keep that fear. I mean, for me, it was very important that I kept that fear inside, so it helped with the narrative. But I think it's prevalent in everyday life.
I just met an astronaut recently, and I was, and she said that there was a Russian and an American with her out in space. And when they looked down, what they saw were no borders. They only saw migratory patterns. And I just wish we could somehow remember that and hold that thought that, borders and visas are just 70 years old. And, the fault lines that Zarrar is talking about. And I recently faced a fault line myself with this idea. I grew up in Calcutta, where people speak Bengali, so I speak fluent Bengali. And there was the idea that Hindi would be the one language which would unite my country. And I speak Hindi at home with my parents. So I speak fluent Hindi. I speak a little Nepali. I speak English, obviously. And, I saw my friends posting again and again on Facebook that all non-Bengali speakers would be thrown out of Bengal just because somebody was trying to impose Hindi from New Delhi. And I was thinking, does that mean my mother, who's a Bombay girl and speaks atrocious Bengali? And my friend said, no, we don't mean your mother or people like you. We mean those Biharis. And the irony of it was that they did not know that Bengali actually came from Bihar, from southern Bihar, from a language called Ardha-Magadhi. So how much of memory, how much of relationships are lost when fault lines are created? And I was thinking, where will I go to? From Calcutta, if I go to Rajasthan, they'll say, but you were born in Calcutta. So these fault lines can lead us anywhere. And, Syria, of course, is like a living example of what's happened. So any comments from any of you? What do you see right now from your perch?
Well, I'm an optimist, so I will remain so. A country that I've studied a little bit on attitude towards immigration. It's like a pendulum. So I'm hoping we've gone to the one extreme and the swing will come back. And it has happened in the past that every time you go too extreme on one side, pressures are there to bring attitudes back. And I'm hoping that it will happen here in the US. In terms of, again, another thought on optimism about travels around. About 30, 40 years ago, if you were living in China, it was impossible to even get a visa. It was a struggle to get a visa. It was now with many countries, China has these 10-year visa you can get. Earlier, you could even actually not even get a passport in China for Chinese people. So on the one hand, while we see all these restrictions that are becoming very, very prominent for us, we also see this huge mobility of people around the world, and that has been made possible because most countries want people. You know, for instance, the United States would like Chinese people to come here and spend their, their dollars, to partake with their prosperity. They would like to welcome them, and that would be true of most of Europe. They would like people from other parts of the country come. So we see a lot of mobility. We see, on the one side level, we see restrictions to stop, Syrian refugees to come to Europe. So Europe is giving, what I would call a bribe of $6.23 billion to Turkey so that they don't let Syrian refugees into Europe. At the same time, many of these countries are reducing restrictions for certain kind of workers, for students, for instance. Earlier, it was impossible for a young Indian woman who's 19, 20 years old, even if she had a admission in a US or in a foreign university, they would not get visa because the fear was that she would go get married and would never come back. Things have changed a lot. You see, most places in the world you see are very cosmopolitan. You see people from all over.
That's a really tough question, but sort of a sketch of some ideas and some thoughts. I agree with Zarrar. I think we see a continuation of history. History does repeat. But some of the things that I think that are different, and maybe also things we can talk about are relevant for us, is that when before these massive currents or these massive changes or the destinies of a country could be moved by one man, one government, one state, we have much more sort of agency and ability to influence things as individuals. I would say that is significantly different than before. And so that means whereas one man could set the course of destiny for all the people that live in that nation state, we now have a bit more control over, or an ability to input or partake in the conversations, whether it's on social media, which is a privileged space, but also as individuals in terms of there are choices that face us and how we look at migration, how we create a vernacular around what is home, who is belonging, what is cosmopolitan, what is nativist. And especially for those of us who do occupy and straddle these different spaces, what's an interesting possibility to that power is that, and this is something I've seen, whereas, being Arab in America, sort of, trial by fire, one of the things we saw was that in many ways made the community more progressive, pay more attention to civil rights and civil liberties. So then the question becomes, how do you interact then with the home country, where sometimes we come from much more regressive examples? And I'm curious and also how this works out in terms of the Desi diaspora, because we do see a lot of Indian Americans be progressive here in the United States, yet are they progressive when it comes to the politics of back home? Do they feel that they have a voice? These are interesting questions to interrogate. So now that we as individuals can also have some kind of effect on where this world is going, even though it seems like we can't. I think we do have much more of a possibility to affect change than before. And I say this as a pessimist. Yeah, this is something for us to maybe think about and talk about together.
Thanks. So, any questions? I think we have time for some questions. Rachel, do we have time for questions? Yes. Yes. Can you just stand up, because the light is shining on our faces, so we can't really see. Yeah.
Yes, I wanted to ask. Wait for the mic just 1 second. We're live streaming. Thank you. It was a wonderful panel. Zarrar, I would like to ask you a silly question and then a serious one. The silly one is you talked a lot about dreams. What language do you dream in? And then the second question I wanted to ask you was, based on your study of immigrants, why does Canada seem to do so much better in accepting immigrants and integrating them into their society? Thank you.
I'll take 3 questions together, and then maybe it'll be easier, because... Is
there another question?
Yeah, there are 2 in that side.
This question is also for Zarrar, whose book I've had the pleasure of reading. Can you talk a little bit more about the story of Adam and Eve and how it relates to the main theme of your book?
And there was someone else in that corner too. And there's a lady there, if we can get her question too.
I'm 82 years old and I have stayed in many places. To me, concept of home is not a place where you stay for 5 years, 10 years or 20 years. It's a place where you're comfortable inside and comfortable in your environments. As humans keep on moving, I move to a place and I say, oh, this is going to be my home. After 5 years, I've gone somewhere else. So over the years, I have a home, home, and home. And next home may be in some planet. So somebody will say, where is your home? Oh, I was on Earth, but now I am Moon. I'm somewhere else. So this concept of home is not a geographical location. It's not the bricks, it's not the ground. It is a philosophical concept of how you feel comfortable inside and in your environments. Any of these things, that is a home. Thank you.
Can we go to the last question? Yes.
Thank you for this panel. It's important. My question is to talk a little bit, and this is for either one of you. We're talking about migration and belonging and home, but I feel that those things in our political landscape globally is determined by economics. So it depends on the social strata you come from, the economic strata, and your experience is completely different. And you had mentioned about, you talked about students getting visa and migration and countries wanting certain categories of immigrants. I find that actually problematic because it's, again, creating a new layer of strata of who gets to come in and who doesn't. So if you didn't have money, you have no space in somewhere. Anyway, I just would love for you to comment on that.
I was just thinking to your comment that, I travel a lot and stay in hotels, and they're very comfortable. I feel very comfortable in them, but I never feel they're home. And even in the apartment I stay in New York, I've got a hibiscus tree, and I try to bring in Indian things into that, because my sense of home somehow is molded maybe by my growing up or by my birth. And I have a friend from Iran who's a photographer, and she had shown me a photograph of a Syrian family migrating. She's an art photographer. And they were dragging a tree with them through the desert. And that was extremely poignant to me, because I remember a tree in my home in a village in Bihar. So I think home is more than something which is just, you can be comfortable anywhere. Anyway, all of you can answer whatever you like, so that's my answer. But Zarrar,
yeah, I'll answer the Adam and Eve thing. The Adam and Eve story is the ultimate home story, right? So not only is this a love story about Adam and his beloved, but also the utopia where they fell in love. So I think the Adam and Eve story is something that I've woven into the fabric of the narrative, especially because in that it's all about where you fall in love with is also as important as who you fall in love with. So,
anybody else? Because we just have like 3 minutes left.
I'll respond to your question. So
it's easy. You want this to keep above your eyes?
No, it's okay. Thanks. I don't remember in which language I dream, but I think my instinctive reaction would be in Punjabi. That's my my language that I spoke with my mother a lot when I was young. In terms of why Canada versus the US, why Canada is so successful. Let me give you a story. All my, career as an...
We just have 2 minutes left.
As an economist, I thought that Canada was doing much better than the United States. About 5-6 years ago, I had a delegation of about 25-30 people from China came to ask me learn about the US immigration system. I started talking about criticizing the US immigration system. My conversation was being translated from English to Mandarin. And in the middle of the conversation, the head of the delegation had it with me. He got up, he was very angry. He says, if you think the US immigration system is so bad, why do the best come here? Why do all the Nobel laureates come here? So depends on what your perspective is. The answer would be different. So although the US has more restrictive policy, I think Canada, immigrants in the US are able to attract a lot of very high skilled people and even medium skilled people who are doing very well. Yeah.
Alia, Prajwal, do you want to answer?
Just briefly to the point on class, that's absolutely correct. Of course, class is and socioeconomic status is a huge differentiating factor in how you experience migration and displacement. And obviously, globally, the passport now. So there are other kinds of dividing lines in that sense. But I would just say watch the space of the Syrian diaspora, because in many ways it didn't fully equalize, but people of all classes were displaced, and it's sort of some of the privileges that came from a different kind of hierarchy inside Syria have been negated. And it is curious to see how it will be very interesting to see how these things play out and whether they still continue to determine who survives the best in this new exile in Europe. And my work with the 10-year project that I'm working on, it's a diversity of socioeconomic class, and you'd be surprised who's doing well and who isn't in some ways.
Thank you all. It was a difficult discussion at this time, and because of things which are going on in our country, and all of you were so honest and so straightforward in what you spoke about. And I hope you go away with lots of food for thought. And ultimately, I'll say something which my mother tells me when I feel homesick. She says, home is where the heart is. So, it's a banal comment, but that's it. Thank you.